Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rachel Wasserman, and I'm the Executive Director of the Jewish Women's Fund of Atlanta, and I'm so glad to have you all with us today. We were originally going to have this program in early March, and because we are now virtual, we are excited that people outside of Atlanta are able to join us, maybe even people outside of America. So there's definitely an upside to pivoting into this virtual world. I hope that by now you've all had a chance to view the film nevertheless. Whether or not you have, I think this conversation will still be very interesting, very dynamic, and very relevant. And I want to go ahead and just thank all of our panelists and our moderator for being with us today and for taking the time to lend your expertise to us. Just a few words of introduction. In case you're not familiar, Jewish Women's Fund of Atlanta promotes social change and creates positive opportunities for Jewish women and girls. We've granted over $1 million to programs and organizations that help facilitate our mission, and we have educational programs and now a new webinar series that promotes our mission in addition to leadership programming and other programming within Atlanta. And also we have significant work that we do in Israel through our grantees. One of our major initiatives is called Change the Culture, and it is part of a national effort by the Safety, Respect, and Equity Coalition, and I'm sure you'll hear more about that from Elana, because we're so excited to have her with us today. And our Change the Culture initiative is what Atlanta is doing to address safety, respect, and equity within the Jewish community, specifically in Jewish workplaces and communal spaces. We launched this initiative in February, just a couple of weeks before we all went into lockdown, with a community-wide summit. We had leaders, both professional, clergy, and lay leaders from throughout the city here in my office, learning about ways to create environments in which discrimination, harassment, and assault have zero tolerance. So that was the beginning of this work. And now this program is the next step in that initiative. And we look forward to continuing it as well beyond today. At the same time that we were launching this Change the Culture initiative, we were finishing up a year-long community-wide needs assessment that we did with Brandeis University to really understand the quantitative and qualitative needs of Jewish women and girls in our Atlanta community. The results came in right as we were having our summit, and one of the key areas that we looked at was Jewish women in the workplace. We had 764 local Jewish women fill out a survey about being in the workforce. Of those, 130 actually work within the Jewish community, and the other 634 work outside of the Jewish community. And I'll tell you that all of the issues that were addressed in the film are experienced by Jewish women in Atlanta. And our employees of our Jewish communal organizations also experience all of those issues. And so we know that we need to start by working within our own community before we can move out to the broader world. And that is why we are here today. The study, by the way, is available on our website, and we would love for you to take a look. We know that this work is more critical now than ever as women face new challenges in our ever-changing work environment. This film kind of fell into our laps by accident because our incredible program manager, Dina, was at another film screening and spoke to the filmmaker and heard about this new project. It wasn't even finished yet when it came to us. And as soon as we heard about it, we knew that we needed to screen it and that we wanted to be among the first. I want to thank her for arranging the panel today and then rearranging it when we went virtual. And I would love to call on her now to introduce our moderator, and we will get going. Again, just by way of housekeeping, if you want to ask any questions, either technical or questions for the panelists, you can chat them to Dina or me, and we'll make sure that we pass them along.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you to everyone, all of our panelists for joining us, and all of you at home. These are some really important issues that we're going to discuss, presented in Nevertheless, as Rachel mentioned. And again, if you have questions, you can text me, you can use the chat feature for me privately, or you can ask your question to the group, and we'll get to as many as we can. But I'd like to introduce Cynthia Good, who will be moderating today's conversation. Cynthia's accomplishments are too numerous to name in total, so I'm just going to mention that she is an author, a seasoned journalist, and an entrepreneur. She's the founder of the website Little Pink Book, an award-winning digital resource for female leaders. And throughout her career, she's been a passionate advocate for women. And we're thrilled that she agreed to join us today. And with that, I will let her launch the discussion.
Hi, Dina. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here. This is such an important topic and really enjoyed the film. We've got a fantastic panel of speakers for everybody today that I think you're really going to enjoy. First of all, I do want to mention we've got one request as we discuss the sensitive and timely issues in this film. Nevertheless, we would like to ask that you please refrain from sharing private or confidential grievances. Individuals with concerns like that are encouraged to consult legal counsel. Our discussion should not be considered legal or other advice. And so I hope that we're going to be hearing from you all. We'd love to see your questions via chat, but that's just something that I wanted everyone to be mindful of. Would love to go ahead and introduce our panelists to you. And we're going to hear their take on what we all saw. Let's go ahead and do this alphabetically and begin with Emily Borna. Emily is an employment attorney who has worked on many cases of sexual harassment as an equity shareholder at Jackson Lewis. She has also represented employers in administrative hearings, and she's handled litigation involving issues of wage, gender, and race discrimination, other forms of discrimination as well, and wrongful discharge. All right, let's introduce Elana Wien. Elana is the executive director of the Safety, Respect, Equity Network. That's a national Jewish network mobilized to create a safe, respectful, and equitable workplace. So welcome to Elana. Hi, how are you? Are you there? Just make sure you guys, you unmute yourself so that we can.
I'm here and excited to be here.
Okay, so happy to see you. All right, introducing Ken Winkler. Ken is a shareholder at Berman, Fink, Van Horn, and he counsels employers and businesses on numerous laws and regulations that govern the workplace. He is an employment attorney, and he has also conducted #MeToo compliance training. And he is the past president of the Marcus Jewish Community Center in Atlanta. Hi, Ken.
Good morning.
Good morning. And then finally, Ulla Zusman. Ulla is a nationally certified counselor who specializes in trauma across the lifespan. And she has worked with women who have experienced sexual assault and domestic violence. And currently she is working at Jewish Family and Career Services. Hi, Ulla.
Hey, good morning.
Good morning.
Good afternoon, something.
Depending on where you are. I guess it's noon, right, in Atlanta. I'm just really interested in, Ulla, we can go ahead and begin with you. What was your take on this powerful film? And I'm wondering if anything surprised you.
Not a whole lot surprised me. I really appreciated them showcasing women that had the courage to speak out. But I know from the statistics and from the clients that we see in our offices that many, many women are trapped and men are trapped by the silence and the shame and the stigma that is associated with sexual assault and sexual harassment specifically. And that it really touched me. One of the key takeaways that I had was that if we label this a women's issue, then the onus is on women and on the victims of sexual harassment in order to address it, and that it needs to be a cultural and a systemic issue. So that's something I took away.
Excellent. We'll be talking some more about that in a little bit. What about you, Emily? What were your thoughts? Can we hear you? I know she was having a few little technical issues, so we're going to try to get Emily on. When you can, just go ahead and jump in there, Emily, so that we know that you're with us right now. Let's go ahead and go to Elana. What did you think?
I thought that the approach of the filmmakers was very powerful in terms of having very diverse speakers, both in terms of victims, survivors, and experts. And I think it did a good job of demonstrating the intersectionality of gender and race in this moment, given the work that we're doing and what this film is focused on. I'm hearing a lot of questions in terms of this broader movement that's happening around racial equality in this country. Does this mean that gender equity needs to come off the table? And I think that the film did a good job of really demonstrating that these pieces are intersectional and that we can hold both and need to at the same time.
Okay, we want to talk more about that too, but we've got Emily back. Yay! Say hello to everybody, Emily, and we'd love to know your take on the film.
Thank you, Cynthia, and good afternoon, everybody. I thought this was a really instructive review of the speak out evolution with respect to sexual harassment issues in the workplace. It's not something that happened overnight. It's certainly come to the forefront since the Me Too movement became viral in 2017. But I like the way this documentary really brought to life with very compelling stories of a number of women, the cautionary tales, the real experiences that women are facing in the workplace, and the way that the law is evolving. While the legal standard discussed at some length of severe and pervasiveness really hasn't changed much since the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was enacted, the interpretation of what that means has really evolved, and the tolerance for what constitutes severe or pervasive conduct of a sexual nature in the workplace has decreased, while the volume of people speaking out has increased.
Very interesting. Thanks, Emily. I think you're so right. I really believe this topic is more timely than ever. And I think there is an intersection with what the big focus is nationally, this whole issue of racism. We posted an article on littlepinkbook.com if you want to check it out, and Dina was circulating it to the panelists as well. It came out this week in the New York Times talking about the owner of CrossFit fostered a sexist company culture, and everyone was surprised to see that he stepped down due to allegations of racism in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder. And the former colleagues said that it was such a pervasive culture of sexual harassment. They said it was really rampant. That was the quote. So they were surprised that he was let go for racism. So I do think there's an intersection, and we talk about the way we treat people. But Elana, I know you have some thoughts along those lines as well, and would like others to weigh in too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was really powerful, Amani Lyle's story and how it was shared in this piece kind of midway through the film. And something that really struck me that she said was, it wasn't until this happened to, white women in Hollywood that people really started paying attention. And I think that really it was perhaps until white women in Hollywood spoke up, it's not that that's when it started happening. And so we know that these issues of sexual harassment and sexual discrimination, as well as racial inequity and racial discrimination, have been happening for generations. And I think that, or I hope that this film continues to make the case for why we need to be able to hold these two pieces at the same time.
Right. Anybody else want to weigh in on that one?
Oh, I would just add, I echo those thoughts. I've been doing harassment training for clients for a number of years. This issue has been around for a long time. I think because of social media and because of the movement, more attention has been brought to it in a different way, which is very positive. And I think because of that, more significant, recognizable people have been held accountable, where I think in years past, there might have been a tendency to cover those stories up and not bring them to light. So I think that's one of the positive movements and developments from the Me Too movement. and through social media and the ability for people to have a voice even outside of the court system. The other point I was just gonna make is, I thought the film did a great job talking about some of the legal challenges that people have when they do bring claims forward. And that focuses on the severe and pervasive standard that the court set as a threshold to be able to assert a claim. And I think an important point or to note here is that the severe and pervasive standard is not the standard that we should be aiming for in the workplace. What is appropriate and what is not appropriate falls far below that significant threshold. In other words, organizations really should be admonishing behavior that falls short of pervasive or severe, and really holding people accountable, especially people in leadership roles, hold them accountable for appropriate behavior, and when they don't act up, to take the initiative and discipline them. It's really a leadership issue, which I thought the film did a great job of pointing out.
Interesting, good point, Ken. Let's just jump into that. So his point, the letter of the law, really that is to guard against, you know, the worst of it, but really we want to see leaders creating a culture where that kind of behavior is nowhere near tolerated. I'd love to hear a little bit, you know, you watch the film, our speakers, is that what you're seeing? Is that reflective of what you are seeing out there in the work that you're doing?
Yes, I mean, unfortunately, these stories are not unusual. They happen in all different industries at all different levels. Education doesn't seem to make a difference. We've seen these problems in medical professions, engineering firms, you know, any industry. No one's immune to it, including the Jewish community, which is, I think, what drove the need to have this program. So unfortunately, sexual harassment and just treating people poorly in general continues to exist, and is something that we definitely need to pay attention to and keep the momentum going on this topic.
And at the same time, we are seeing more high-profile cases. We're seeing this covered a lot in the news. It seems like this is being tolerated less, and it is, you know, I see that a lot of the leaders, they just aren't getting away with it anymore like they used to. Emily, is that your sense of the situation today as well?
Absolutely. I mean, again, since the Me Too movement went viral in 2017, you can't go a week in the news cycle without seeing a notable celebrity caught in the crosshairs of this speak out evolution. And we're really evolving even from Me Too to, you know, I saw, I witnessed, I heard, and time's up. And to that end, you know, representing employers in the workplace, while it's been really clear, there were a couple of landmark Supreme Court cases that came out in, you know, over 20 years ago that set the bar. As Ken said, you know, we have this federal law of the land. There's a lot of variation from state to state, and it's no coincidence that the three women who are highlighted in the documentary who experienced pretty egregious hostility in the work environment and unwelcome touching of a sexual nature, all are in California. And a lot of times, you know, legally, when we talk about the spectrum of laws, there's a lot more protection for employees out on the left coast than, for example, Georgia, which is one of the truer employment at will states. But, you know, what happened to Miss Brooks, the 911 dispatcher, who was physically groped, it's so interesting. I think if we were to hear her case today, even if she's not a celebrity, one touching of a sexual nature is pretty well regarded legally as severe. It doesn't have to happen repeatedly. Any kind of unwelcome touching of a sexual nature is going to be considered severe and pervasive at this point. And so the evolution there, and particularly the affirmative obligation on employers to promulgate policies that make very clear, you know, look, employers are not judges and juries that struggle with defining what constitutes actionable sexual harassment, but in our workplace, in this environment, we're not going to tolerate these sorts of behaviors. That's the law of the land, and any kind of conduct that runs afoul of it is going to be a basis for taking some some disciplinary action. And employers are training on those policies and doing more than just paying lip service to them on the heels of this movement.
Very good point. And I know we're already hearing from some of the folks, some of you who are watching. Kathy Wexler made the point that the film focuses on the importance of teaching boys and girls at a young age that they are equal. Do you think, Ula, that that message is beginning to get across to people?
I think it depends on the community, and I think it depends on the family. It depends on the school environment and the school culture. You know, very powerful point was made that for young women, the gaze, the male gaze, is such a powerful and defining factor. And so I think there has been a shift in the culture, but I think we've got a long way to go still. The psychological impact of sexual harassment and gender harassment, the resultant physiological and somatic complaints that arise from it, the emotional and relational aspect of it, and then from a workplace point of view, just the work identity aspect. All of those things are so severely affected by sexual harassment that we've got a long way to go still.
I think you're right. And Elana, do you want to weigh in on that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that also came up in the film, and that Ken was touching on too, is, you know, where is the piece of accountability and who does that sit with? And I do think that's another intersectional piece between the gender and race aspects of this. It's not on women to ensure their safety. It's not on non-white people to ensure their safety in the workplace. There's a communal, collective responsibility in that. And I think it's the same in terms of teaching, you know, male identifying and female identifying kids at a young age that they're equal. It's also teaching them that they're being raised in an unequal system and that they have a responsibility as they grow up to be part of creating a more equitable situation. So touching on the 911 dispatcher, I was less horrified by the egregious abuse as the supervisor, because of the impact that came across through the film on the dispatcher. You just sensed, and I'm just getting kind of chills as I'm remembering that moment, just the incredible disappointment that she had, a woman who had committed her life to doing this work, that a trusted colleague supervisor had not taken appropriate steps previously, according to her, to ensure her safety. And you can tell that was actually, or it seemed that was where a lot of the harm happened. The harm was from the direct abuse, of course, but it was also that additional harm from the trusted colleague, supervisor in that power position who's continuing to enable that. And I think that's the biggest takeaway when you see a film like this. You hear the kind of egregious incidents, and it is, I think, human nature to try to distance ourselves from it and say, okay, the world is made up of mostly good actors, some bad actors, and this is all about just separating, as she mentioned, the bad apples. But it's not just bad apples. It's a lot of good apples that are being passive and are not building the muscle that they need to really ensure that we're protecting each other.
Yeah, you made so many good points. I have so many questions based on what you said, but you know, it's not all bad actors, right? And oftentimes we've had conversations that it can even be people who are very well intentioned. The micro discrimination, you know, those subtle forms of discrimination that it's part of the culture, it's ingrained in the culture. And all too often, and I will say we, because I'm sure I've done it too, we may let something slide. Maybe it's humor. I think we need to talk about the importance of that. You know, to Ken's point, once it's against the law, I mean, it's bad, but all the way through the spectrum, there is this sense that there are cultures where the harassment is more pervasive and it's just conducive and people were getting away with it all the time. So Elana, do you want to weigh in on that? And I'd love to hear from our legal experts as well.
Yeah, I think I would just briefly say that I do, you know, very much believe that it is a spectrum. And so, you know, for the entity that I, you know, represent, the SRE network, the reason why we're focused on safety, respect, equity, for some folks, they just see this as this is huge. These are like three totally separate buckets. They're not. They're on a continuum. and in the same workplace in which there are significant safety issues that aren't being paid attention to, that's going to affect what equity looks like. In an environment where there's respect, you can still have issues around safety. And so I think understanding that we're all in this, we're all existing in this inequitable society together. And so we will see things in our workplace that are not respectful, not safe, not equitable. And we will be called upon to, to pay attention and to intervene, but also to do the work in ourselves of really understanding how we're impacting our colleagues.
And Emily, I know that you work with a lot of companies, and you must see quite a wide variety of different cultures, workplace cultures, when it comes to this. Oh, we lost her again. Okay, Eric, Ken, you take that one because you're in that same situation working.
Yeah, I see it. I see it, again, in all different industries, all forms of business. There are different, obviously, work cultures, and that's why leadership is just it's so important. It's really the beginning of all of this, is setting the right culture, and that's a leadership issue. It starts at the top. It's how people behave day in and day out. It's how they talk to one another. It's how they address people. It's not calling people by nicknames. It's not talking about sexual escapades that happened over the weekend at the water cooler. It's really talking and acting professionally in the workplace and being careful about what you say and physically where you put your hands. In some ways, what's very frustrating about harassment in some sense is this is really avoidable behavior. Right? This is people that can control how they act in the workplace, whether they're professional or not, and whether they have self-respect and whether they respect other people. One of the things when I do harassment training, one of my final slides of any presentation is a photo of Mr. Rogers. And the point I make is, it's 3, 4, 5-year-olds. We used to watch Mr. Rogers, and what was that show all about? It was about respecting yourself and respecting other people that might be different from you. But it's like, how do you play nice? Well, you respect the other person and you play nice. And as little children, we seem to grasp that idea. But for some reason, as adults in the workplace, we lose sight of just the simple notion of being respectful to someone and treating them with respect. And if people would really just go to work every day, focus on their work, be respectful of how they communicate with other people and how they treat other people, the truth is a lot of these harassment issues, why they still would exist, we'd see a great improvement and a downturn in the number of cases and incidents we have.
For sure. Ula, let's talk a little bit about the trauma. We talked about the subtle discrimination, and we talked about, the more serious cases. It all impacts women, though, doesn't it? To some degree, I would think, and deeply.
Absolutely. So there are so many psychological and emotional repercussions from sexual harassment. You're looking at depression and anxiety. You're looking at shock and denial, at phobias, at irritability and anger. Negative body image is huge. Confusion, powerlessness, shame, all of these things impact. And then we know from the physiology, cortisol rises, our stress hormones kick in, and then you're looking at physiological complaints and somatic issues as a result of the emotional distress. So anything from headaches and muscle aches and sleep disturbances through sexual disturbances, high blood pressure, all the way up to cardiovascular functioning and autoimmune disease. And for those, some individuals and also those that have previously experienced trauma, you could be looking at PTSD. So this has wide-reaching repercussions. And then you're looking at identity issues as well. We are gendered before we're even born. One of the first questions someone asks is, what are you having? So it's in the air we breathe. We are gendered from the get-go. And so it's a fundamental part of our identities. And that violation goes bone deep when someone harasses from a sexual or a gendered orientation. People then have trouble with betrayals, like the 911 dispatcher, that disturbs interactions with colleagues, with trusted loved ones, and with future relationships that can be formed. So there's a trust factor that gets seriously damaged there. And then the last piece of it is also identity as workers. People may second guess their achievements. Was I only hired for my sexual appeal? And then it impacts all the other functions that happen at work, our community and relationships, our sense of value and meaning that we derive from our work because we spend so much of our time within the workplace. All of these things are so severely impacted.
Yeah, I think you're really right. And I felt like that maybe was missing, if anything, from the film, just a little bit, is so much of this is about women's sense of themselves, right? And their rights and what they can really expect and demand in terms of that treatment. One of the attendees who's joining us talked about just the fact that the workplace is set up with an imbalance because we still see women being paid less than men. So right then and there, you set up a culture where, you know, one gender is viewed as more powerful and more important than the other. And then, you know, does it just snowball from there?
Yeah, I heard something the other day in connection with race, and it applies to gender as well, where it was said, you know, we don't invite people of color to the table because that is our table that we are then, you know, so magnanimously reaching out and adding to. It's still defined as the white table. And I think that's the situation in gender as well. It's the male table that maybe we are being invited to join, as opposed to owning our place within that sphere.
Well, sure, because the corporate culture was set up by men, right? I mean, that's how this all started. So where do we go from here? This whole idea of boys will be boys. There are certain things you just can no longer tolerate, right?
For sure. It starts with the books that we give our kids to read, you know, from picture books onwards. Girls as heroines, girls as having courage, girls as engineers and having ingenuity, and being able to broaden what the definition is. One of the speakers on the film was talking about how we distance ourselves from anything female as males. Don't throw like a girl, don't hit like a girl, don't scream like a girl. We need to change the language that we use when we're raising children. We need to change the curricula in schools. We need to look at all of that stuff as it impacts the identity formation right at the beginning, because that's where we're going to see future generations changing.
Beautifully said. Thank you, Ula. Now, we talked a lot about the fact that there are variations in laws from state to state. I know Ken, you mentioned it, and Emily also mentioned it. So what does a woman do if she feels like she is in a hostile work environment, if she confronts the boss, or if she goes to HR? Her role is in jeopardy. And I know one of the statistics from Emily that she shared the other day is 75% of those who step up, there's some form of retaliation. So what happens, Ken? What is the recommendation? I mean, what should you do if you're in that situation?
So as a lawyer answer, every situation can be a little bit different.
Right.
I just need to start with that. But, you know, as a general answer, you bring your complaints through the food chain of the organization. So most companies, sound companies, do have harassment policies in place. And if you look at those policies, there should be spelled out a chain of complaints, and a good policy will allow for alternative avenues, not just one person, you know, where you're required to speak to your immediate supervisor. That might be the person that's harassing you. So you can bring your complaint to HR. I would say if you're unsatisfied with the way HR has handled it, then move up the organization to any senior executive and lodge a complaint. And certainly if the incident is getting to the point where it's interfering with your enjoyment at work, your ability to do your job, then certainly seek out counsel. An attorney is a very important person to reach out to help navigate through the situation. Sometimes they can intervene on behalf of the employee and introduce themselves to the organization and help prevent some retaliation, which is always a concern of the individual. So it's a great question. It gets pretty complicated, but certainly the one thing the person should not do is just tolerate it.
I just want to jump in, Cynthia, with a question that just came through my text that relates to what Ken just said.
Okay.
If you're not experiencing the harassment, but you are a witness to it, how does that differ? If you're a bystander, what are the options available to you in terms of reporting, and should you report such behavior?
And we've got Emily Borna back, so that's a great one for her to tackle, Emily.
Sorry for that power surge and disconnect, but that's an excellent question, Dina, from one of our participants. And to a large degree, that's going to vary depending on your organization's policy. You know, people are encouraged to speak up and speak out, and the courts have made it really clear, as Ken was saying, not only do you need to have a policy with multiple avenues to address a concern, you know, some of the most effective policies are going to place an affirmative obligation on others who see something to do something. And that means there has to be a number of ways to raise that concern. A lot of people are reluctant to do so. There's certainly a fear of retaliation, and you know, a good policy is going to preclude that as well. You know, it runs the gamut in terms of how you're comfortable addressing something. You know, in a lot of hostile work environment circumstances, if somebody says something that's offensive, you know, who are litigators and probably pretty comfortable speaking out, a lot of people are going to be reluctant to call someone on that in a group setting and say, that's offensive. I think you crossed the line, you've gone too far. That's certainly an option. Another option is going to be to go to any kind of management representative or to human resources and to address that concern. And, you know, as an attorney who's represented employers, management for over 25 years in the workplace, and as the Supreme Court made clear over 20 years ago, your organization should ideally be the first place you go to try to address these issues. If they're not resolved, obviously there's other remedies, whether it's with counsel or whether it's with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission or whether it's bringing a lawsuit. But you shouldn't just stick your head down in the sand and ignore things. If things have come to light, they should be addressed. And just two other points, and I apologize if I missed some of the conversation on this, but so much of this issue is about an imbalance of power. And when we talk about a cultural shift and we talk about diversity and inclusion, which I think this documentary touched on nicely, you know, as part of this evolution, while we have become more diverse, the statistics are still really alarming with respect to women, or whether it's an issue of minorities. In terms of leadership, who is at the table, who is in the room where things are happening, that shift has to happen to focus on not just the conscious actions, but the unconscious bias that exists in these workplaces, and that has to be squarely addressed.
We talked a little bit about unconscious bias, absolutely so important. And, you know, nevertheless, the film's title, we saw in that film that the women who stood up and did the right thing paid for it. I mean, their whole lives were different and they lost out. And it was really a tough lesson to see. I feel like we are culturally at a turning point now. And even in Atlanta, we're seeing some news stories lately. Some organizations have been called out by employees who currently are with those organizations, that the treatment is inappropriate. I think steps are being taken, but this begs the question, and I know we don't want to give legal advice, right? But maybe we can talk a little bit about what you have seen that works. Do women get together in groups and go in together? Do you sit down and talk confidentially with a trusted colleague or a supervisor who you personally know and trust? What other sorts of things can be done to address this in a way where women feel safe and that they're going to walk away from the situation still intact?
I think I would just chime in, you know, less of a suggestion, a strategy, and more as a frame is, you know, I think, and I saw some comments in the chat around this and around kind of the denial that this exists, and including in Jewish spaces, that let's all just start with the understanding that these issues exist everywhere, in every workplace, including the Jewish community, because we are in an inequitable society where these unhealthy power dynamics are baked in. So if you're not seeing it in your workplace, you're not paying attention. And that we all have a collective responsibility to address it. So when I think of that dichotomy of the victim survivor and the perpetrator abuser, and the idea that if it's a woman, that woman who needs to go and report it, and it's all on her back, which is really what you saw carry out throughout the film, that right there is the problem. So, you know, how do you create a company and an organizational culture with an understanding that on an ongoing basis, we need to be collectively reflecting on our culture, the extent to which people are feeling and experiencing psychological and physical safety, and the ways that, you know, anyone who's in different power positions within an entity are continually in an ongoing dialogue about these issues. And so it's not some distant thing that's happening over there and we're only looking at the most egregious.
Right, it's really pervasive. And we've already talked about on this panel, and we saw in the film that from organization to organization, whether it's a corporation or a nonprofit or a small company or large, the culture differs drastically. And Ken, I know when we were talking before, I mean, we talked about that this is a tough question for men as well as women to think about, okay, I'm at this company, what is this culture? And is this a culture I want to be part of?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for not beating up on me. I recognize that I'm the only male on the panel, but you've all treated me very well, so thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I think everyone has to assess for themselves, is this a place that is right for me? Even putting aside how the company responds to things, no one should work somewhere where they don't feel respected and they're not treated appropriately. So I think at some point, everyone has to make a decision whether this is the appropriate place for me to work. And hopefully, if someone's working somewhere where they're not comfortable, it's not always the case, but sometimes they have at least enough leverage and enough opportunity to leave on their own terms and find a better opportunity. And that's something that everyone has to decide for themselves. I'm not saying that's the great solution, that someone's career should be derailed because they're subject to it. It's just a practical issue that everyone has to kind of come to terms with on their own situation is, do they want to continue to work somewhere where they're not respected? And I don't think people should. They shouldn't have to, and they shouldn't force themselves to do it if it's avoidable. Mm-hmm. I think one of the things we, not to lose sight of when we talk about culture, is investing in human resources. I think one of the common threads you'll see in these situations is where the HR department is not given a lot of credibility from upper management. They're not listened to, and the employees recognize that. They're aware when they work at an organization where HR is not respected and going to HR isn't going to result in anything. So I keep harping on this. It's such a leadership issue. And it's so important if we're looking even at the Jewish community and different organizations, there's a board of directors, and really it starts with the board of directors and making sure that the board is properly managing the organization, and from the board setting the tone and setting the messaging that this is an important issue. And the organization is going to spend sufficient resources, time, and attention in making sure that the workplace is free of harassment, and that when problems are brought to our attention, it doesn't necessarily mean that someone has to be fired, but it means the problem should be addressed and appropriate steps are taken to make sure that it doesn't continue. And I think if we start to see organizations from the leadership speak like that, set an example, act in a way that reflects that belief, then that's going to be where major change is going to happen. Without that happening, a lot of this is just going to unfortunately continue.
Of course, it's got to come from the top, but I really want to stay with this topic a bit more. The cultures being so different, and really, you know, there are some things, look, we just can't control, right? They're beyond our control, and it may not be a good cultural fit, but I still feel, as we saw in the film, and as we experience today across industries, I think the onus still is on the woman. Elana, I think you talked a little bit about the victim shouldn't be in charge of protecting herself, like we saw in the film. But this is what we're seeing. And, you know, Ken, you kind of just reiterated that. I mean, you didn't say it, if you don't like the culture, you have to leave. But the bottom line is, oftentimes, this is still the case. So, Emily, what do we do about that?
So, one of the things that we've seen, and I think the film highlights this, is that a lot of legislatures, and there's a patchwork from state to state, but a lot of places are mandating training. That's not the case in Georgia, for example, but it is certainly the case in California. It's been the case for some time, and it's the case in more and more states, Connecticut, New York, I could go on and on. It is a best practice, and that's number one, which I think is, awareness. What is the policy here? What is the expectation? What is the culture? It's important for organizations to take a step back and identify that on the front end. And then there has to be accountability and transparency and fairness around that process. That doesn't mean that if you make a complaint, you necessarily get exactly whatever the remedy is that you're seeking. Don't get me wrong. While this is a very significant issue, on occasions there is abuse of this process. Somebody gets a bad review, turns around and brings a complaint, wants a bossectomy. And again, the organization has to commit to doing an even-handed, prompt, thorough investigation to determine factually what happened, so that it can be addressed and remedied. I think it's also important to point out, particularly with respect to touchings, that we've been really focused on civil remedies, but there are also remedies in the criminal justice system, which the 911 dispatcher took advantage of when her organization was not responsive. When they interrogated her, she went to the district attorney. She filed a complaint of assault and battery in a criminal proceeding. The wrongdoer, the harasser, actually served 120 days in jail. And then unfortunately, she suffered more hostilities in the work environment and retaliatory actions afterwards. But those avenues have to be explored, and you have to raise awareness, and you have to set the tone from the top down, as so many have said, in terms of what the expectation is, and in terms of how we're going to put our arms around this and include people to feel comfortable. The workplace is always changing and evolving. I mean, look, we're all working remotely at this point. And, in that respect, I think incidents of touching are certainly down, but that doesn't mean that some of the same power imbalance dynamics and hostilities don't persist, even virtually. And it's important that, that people have reasonable expectations about what the culture is and how to address concerns when they come up.
Yeah, very well said. I think that it's so easy to not acknowledge these difficult things, and so essential that we do. One of the attendees, Donnie Winkler, is asking, how can we address the issues around the denial of a woman's traumatic experience, both her own and those of her abusers in the workplace? There is this denial. And then talk about trauma, for a woman to experience this and then for it to be denied. I mean, Ula, you want to touch on that a little bit?
Sure. So the denial is one piece, and the victim blaming is another that the film did a really good job of delineating. This is the only aspect of a crime where the victim is on trial and the victim is thought to be lying or suspect. And the film gave the statistics of how rarely that happens. The denial is violating in and of itself. The impact of that is huge on an individual because they finally summoned the courage to go and get it dealt with and taken the risk of having the retaliation and their job on the line, and then to be denied or to be ridiculed or minimized is so traumatic and so affecting of the individual. Something I wanted to touch on that we spoke about a little bit ago was ways of confronting if you're a witness. And some people aren't comfortable speaking up and saying, that's wrong, that's out of line. But you can phrase it as, I don't get that joke, can you explain it to me? And that exposes the thinking behind it and puts the person on the spot to justify or to explain their thinking without coming out and saying, that's wrong, I don't agree with you. So sometimes another woman may be in a position where she's not able to speak up because it's a boss or a supervisor, but that's another technique that can be used to challenge that kind of thinking.
I want to talk about that some more in a bit, but I know, Elana, you wanted to weigh in on this.
Yeah. So I think, the idea that, that the onus is on the woman, and that if she's experiencing this, her choices are basically to leave. you know, we're a network that's focused on changing organizational culture. So if this was, you know, if our focus was on, you know, the individual, sure, if I was advising a friend, you know, I want what's best for their mental health, and sure. But I don't think that that's the organizational response. I think that we're past that. We need to be past that now. And within the Jewish community, we have a nonprofit sector that is 70% identifying as female for Jewish nonprofits, and only 30% of women are leading those organizations. So it's a female working force that is male led, and that woman who leaves that environment will be replaced by another woman who will experience it. And it shouldn't be on her to carry the weight of this. You know, I think that this is really systemic in all of our organizations, and it's on the responsibility of the organization and everyone within the organization to be part of the solution.
I agree 100%, but that would be great. But the reality is it's not happening yet. You know, and I think that for those who are witnessing this, I think it takes a tremendous amount of courage to say, that's not okay, especially if you're one of the guys. You want to weigh in that? You're one of the guys. I'm
the only guy. I mean, I'm one of the guys.
My own point of view.
Yeah, it's again, it's a tough thing for people to step up to the plate and do what's right and speak out when they see something that's not appropriate in the workplace. The film talks about different situations of retaliation. And one thing I wanted to let people know is the most filed reason someone goes to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the number one claim that they complain about is retaliation. It's not the underlying harassment or discrimination, but year in and year out in recent history, more people complain about being retaliated against, whether it's complaining about other forms of discrimination or sexual harassment than the actual underlying bad acts themselves. And so there is statistically good reason for people to be afraid to come forward. And, you know, again, that's a real challenge. And that's why it's just so important that if you work somewhere and you're looking at the organization and you're reviewing things like a policy, one of the things to look out for is that there should be a retaliation clause in the policy. Every sound harassment policy should have a retaliation clause that says you are not going to be retaliated against if you bring things forward. But having a policy just isn't enough. Again, from a leadership standpoint, part of any organization's training should be touching upon retaliation, explaining to employees what the policy says and that the company stands by not retaliating against people and supporting people that come forward with a complaint and assuring them that it's going to be looked into. These are just things that we need to be aware of. And if you're working somewhere, these are the things that you want to be looking at in your organization to see, does the company really believe in this? Or are they trying to create the right culture?
So, Emily, why are companies continuing to tolerate this kind of harassment that is, you know, talk about the framework. This is happening in a lot of places.
Well, it is pervasive, but I think the fact that people are talking about it more is pushing us towards a better direction. I'll tell you, I work with employers of all shapes and sizes, and some of the biggest organizations, some of the Fortune 100 companies, you know, to the letter of the law and the instruction from the Supreme Court in some landmark cases, Burlington and Farragher back from 20 plus years ago, don't just have more than one place to go with a concern. You either go to management or your HR. They may have a third-party staffing, a hotline service you can call. You know, there may be an anonymous way to make a complaint, which some people feel more comfortable with. You know, sometimes, unfortunately, and I find this true in the nonprofit world on a number of occasions, sometimes those with the best intentions do some of the worst things. And in that respect, because there's disparity in the treatment. And again, with good intentions, one of the things that you have to look for in a workplace is that you have some guidance, you have some expectation about what, you know, what is the law of the land here. And when you make exceptions to that in one case, you know, then why don't you do it in another? And that goes back to the concept of, you know, of being fair and being even-handed and, you know, having a seat at the table. So, you know, from my perspective, I certainly think things are improving, but as the documentary pointed out, we've got a long way to go. And this isn't something that happened overnight. I mean, a lot of people don't even realize the Me Too phrase, you know, was coined 10 years before it went viral by a woman named Tarana Burke, who herself was the victim of sexual assault and, you know, found power and healing through creating this organization to work with other victims and to speak out. And so, you know, in that respect, I'm hopeful. And I think the legislatures and the courts are taking note of that, and certainly the companies, although it may not be as much of a smoking gun on your nose, sleep with me as you're fired, as it was 25 years ago. There is an awareness that is growing and a tolerance for this decreasing.
Is that what you're saying too, Elana?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. And I think that there is a, this current moment with COVID happening and the way that it's turning everything upside down and other disruptions in our society. I think that there's also a danger of us going backward. And so that's why I'm just so appreciative for you all for convening this conversation and really shining a spotlight on these issues and how far we still have to go. Because we really do need to keep this front and center.
Yeah, good point. And it's a little bit before 1 o'clock, but we're told by Rachel and Dina we can go ahead and continue the conversation if you're able to continue to join us for a little bit longer. I've got to go back to Ken, because as we heard in the film, it was a quote and you kind of reiterated this yourself. It's a tough time to be one of the guys. Talk a little bit about that so we can be sensitive to your perspective too.
Yeah, you know, look, I think from a guy's perspective, I guess there's always, when the Me Too movement really came to light in the last couple of years, this concern, well, we can't have meetings with people anymore, and how do I socialize with someone at work, and what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. And I don't know, I don't think it's that complicated really. Again, from a man's perspective, if you go to work and you treat people with respect, I keep saying the same thing, but if you talk to people professionally and you speak about things that are appropriate and avoid conversations and jokes and just use a gut check, you can avoid a lot of the just human pitfalls that people make at work. It's just not that hard to do really if you pay attention to it and you make it a priority to be professional no matter where you work.
Right, and yet, you know, what you said is also true, is that we have seen some of a backlash as more of these cases have come to the forefront, and a lot of the bosses now are very hesitant to do things like have behind closed door private conversations with women in the organization. We know that's where the promotions are given and the opportunities are given, even in the most appropriate of work cultures. So I think that's another watch out. Emily, do you have a take on that?
Yeah, we've seen the pendulum swing both ways. I can tell you, you know, when I do training, I often refer to the film Disclosure, which was with Demi Moore and Michael Douglas, and the tables were turned a little there because she was supervising him and, you know, presented him with the conundrum of sleep with me or you're fired, if you will. If he wanted to continue in his role and succeed, he needed to submit to her sexual advances, despite being happily married with another actress portrayed at home. And, you know, in reaction to some of that, we saw, particularly in financial industries, Wall Street, at one point in time, companies were requiring employees to sign love contracts. You know, the reality is, human nature is, sometimes romance blossoms in the workplace. And it's a fine line for employers to manage. While it's not an employer's intent to regulate personal morality, what has to be clear is that actions that happen, whether they're inside or outside of the workplace, that have an impact on what goes on in the workplace, have to be the concern of the employer. and have to be addressed if they run afoul of the culture and the letter and spirit of the policies that are in place. And so, you know, in that respect, yes, the pendulum swings both ways, and I think it's a very raw time. It's a powder keg out there right now. People are on edge for so many reasons, but all the more reason to be sensitive to this, and also not to knee-jerk a reaction, not to knee-jerk a no, not to knee-jerk a dismissal, but to really pay attention to these concerns, make sure there are open door policies and avenues to express concerns and to look into them when they happen. There's no guarantee, you know, that there'll be a particular result, but a company should be guaranteeing that if a concern is raised, it will be promptly reviewed.
Okay, yeah, good point. And I know Ken wanted to weigh in with what about inappropriate behavior outside of the office?
Yeah, I've had a lot of situations where people misbehave outside of the actual office. It could be at a conference, at a business meeting, at a seminar. And one of the things that's important for organizations as part of their training and to have it in their policy is to make sure the employees know that whenever they're involved in any type of a workplace event or a sponsored event, the rules apply. It's not just within the four walls of the actual business. It's anywhere where people are interacting on a business reason. And sadly, too often I've handled a number of situations. They involve alcohol a lot. So many harassment claims stem from people going to a social event related to work and someone drinks too much and then they engage in, you know, irresponsible bad behavior. And I've seen that both from helping an organization who gets a claim based on that and then working with an individual trying to help them in a situation because they lose their job because of that conduct.
Great point. Yeah, for sure. It's like after hours, right? A lot of these incidents happen. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap up momentarily, but I want to give everyone a chance to weigh in, maybe help us with scripting, not in terms of advice, but maybe in terms of some of the things you've seen work. What can we do and say if you are a leader, if you are a victim, or if you witness this? Maybe give us some ideas around verbiage or approach that we can take, because I think that a lot of people are watching and we want to do something to make it right and to move us forward in a positive direction. So I think that might help. You want to go ahead and start with you, Elana?
I think I might pass this over to an attorney.
Okay, Emily?
Well, I think one tool that's really helpful, and again, thinking of the Jewish organizations in particular, is having a mentoring program and making sure that there are connections already in place if somebody does have a concern where they can turn to address those concerns with a level of comfort. I mean, I think the other clear answer is to be sure that your organization is doing more than just paying lip service to the concepts of equal employment opportunity, that there is regular training going on, even if it's not required here in Georgia, and you know it is in many other states. At least once a year, you ought to be convening, even if it's something as simple as reading your policy out loud and asking people if they have questions. But you have to make that come to life, and you have to emulate, I think as Ken has said a number of times, the leadership. Be an example unto others. Dugma yishit. Show that you take these issues seriously, and if you see something, say something.
If you see something, say something. Great advice. Thanks, Emily. And let's go ahead and go for some final comments. Ula, anything else you just want to leave folks with today?
One of the things that really struck me in the film was the issues of masculine supremacy, male supremacy, and the one line that stood with me was that being a real man gets in the way of being a good man. And I think if we focus on raising good men, if we focus on the next generation in terms of what it means to embrace your female side, embrace the emotions, embrace so many of the different personality and quality aspects that we deny men and boys, I think we have a real shot at creating empathy that will lead towards change.
Beautiful. Thanks, Zula. And Ken, any final thoughts you want to leave folks with today?
Sure. Emily did a great job talking about some of the basic blocking and tackling that every organization should implement in having policies and training. And I think along with that, one of the most important things is addressing problems when they're brought to your attention, no matter how uncomfortable it might be to have a conversation with someone who's accused of something or to deal with a problem. It is so important for an organization to own up to it, to address it, deal with it, and bring resolution to it. And if you look at news stories, if you think about the Matt Lauer situations and all of these, Harvey Weinstein, all these things that come to the headlines, the facts might be a little bit different, but there's one underlying theme that is central to all of them, and that is the organization at a high level knew about conduct, and instead of stepping in and doing the right thing, even if it was uncomfortable, they more or less looked the other way or tolerated it. And that's what we cannot as a society and in the world we live in tolerate that anymore. And I think in different areas, we've seen where people are coming forward and trying to stop, the looking the other way and really making people be held accountable. So it's just so important that it's a basic HR principle when you're dealing with people. If you have a problem in any relationship, you identify it, you address it, and you don't look the other way, and you try to resolve it.
Great point. And I think now there's a huge incentive to do so, right? Because we've seen so many leaders and organizations be toppled recently because they did look the other way and cover for other leaders in the organization. And clearly that's not being tolerated across the board anymore, which is great. Elana, final thought from you.
Sure. I think I would just use my final thought moment to just look up something from the chat that for folks that are interested in exploring more the intersections of racism, sexism, and intersectionality, that there's a nevertheless town hall panel that's happening today that's actually featuring Amani Lyle, who's featured in the film. And so the link's there. And, my final thought is these issues are critically important, even more so in the midst of a pandemic and, nationwide discussions around race and gender. This is a moment. Let's have this moment not be a moment where we slide back, but where we take big leaps forward.
I love that. Take advantage of this amazing moment. And one final thought from you, Emily.
I would just add that, knowledge is power. And as things evolve and continue to play out, the fact that people are aware of this and encouraged to come forward is really hopeful. And I think bodes well for, for our future. In every respect, as we see, the public rallying behind these concepts. And even in the last 2 weeks, some more landmark decisions from the Supreme Court on these very issues.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone who participated and joined us today, all of our attendees, and thanks so much to the fantastic panelists for taking your time and sharing your wisdom on such an important topic. And Rachel, you and Dina and your whole team for having this really important conversation, which helped, I think, move us forward as a society.
Well, thank you, Cynthia, and to all of our panelists and for everybody for tuning in today. So many of the issues that were brought up are things that we are addressing with the Jewish Women's Fund, men as allies, addressing gender norms from a very young age, and certainly standing up and saying, we do have a problem and we're acknowledging it as a community and are taking steps to move forward, to offer training, to offer education. So we hope that you will continue to engage with us beyond today. You'll certainly receive communication about additional ways to do that. Thank you for taking time to be with us, for taking more time than you had planned to be with us. And we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you so much to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.